moving on to sort of piggyback off of our last tutorial, we're going to talk about parameters within functions. So we learned that how to define a function and call it and return a value from the function. So what we're going to do now is pass an argument to a function so that we can perform a certain manipulation on that argument, or parameter as it's called here. So let's write our first example. Define function called parameters. And in this function, we're going to have our first parameter. Let's just call it a, right? And then we're just going to print a. So, and then when we call the function, so it's called parameters, we need to define a. So let's say a, for example, is a string called this is a parameter. As you can see, this string was passed into the function and manipulated somehow, and in this case it was manipulated through print. Alright, so we can also pass more than one argument, and let's make a new function now. Let's just erase this. Define it as add, for example, and we're going to have two functions called a and b. Two parameters inside the function called a and b. A little tongue-tied today. So let's do c equals a plus b. And then we're going to return c. And so when we want to, so this time let's do the right way, the proper way, and say we have a result variable, result equals add, and don't forget we need two new parameters now. So let's say 12, and to separate them we do comma and then 5. So a is equal to 12 and b is equal to 5. And then, so we have that result, and then we're going to print this result. Print result. Now let's build that. Whoops, I made a mistake here. Oh, I forgot the colon again, of course, silly me. Don't forget those colons. So, of course, 17. We can also do this with strings, so let's do that. Instead of having numbers, let's have 1, and then this b, a is 1, and b is word. And then that sort of adds them together in one string. And that pretty much concludes that part, and let's move on to the next part. So this part is for default variables, default parameters, excuse me. What these are basically the default values of a parameter defined in a function if that parameter is not manipulated. So let's call the default param. That's our function. And then we have the parameters a, b, c. And it's gonna be written in the following way. So in these parentheses, where our default parameter with our parameter is, you write b equals our default value 4, and c equals our default value 5. This is just an example, so it could be anything, whatever your heart content, sort of. All right. So keep in mind that parameters with default values should be put last. So as you can see here, a, we wouldn't have like b before a, and so on, stuff like that. So here we go. So we have our default values defined. So let's continue. And then we're going to have return a plus b plus c. That's xc. All right. So let's see. Let's store that to results again, and then we're going to do default param. And let's say a is equal to 3. And as you see here, we are not going to define these with commas and then a value. So let's do that. Build. Oh, forgot to print. Whoops, my bad. Print. And then result. As you can see, it added 3 plus 4 plus 5, which is 12. So the default parameters were passed into the function and which is printed out. And so keep in mind here, as you can see, functions in Python pass by value. So, and we'll also talk later about passing by reference, which is more complicated, but will be done later. But in general, functions pass by default by value. So literally we took 4 and we passed it. Alright, moving on, let's talk about scope. Scope is like the range of use of a parameter inside a function. So within a function, the scope of a parameter is within the function itself. So for example, let's have a new function here called scope. So scope call with a parameter a, and let's say a equals a plus 1. This is just some examples, so don't worry about specifics. So print, we're going to print a, lowercase a, and then return a. So scope, then we're going to call scope, and then a is going to be equal to 5. As you can see, it did everything for us. Now, if we wanted to call a, we wouldn't be able to call a outside this because a is only defined inside the function. So let's say if we tried to print a, why is my caps lock on? A. As you can see, it gives us an error. A is not defined. So remember, in parameters in the function are only within the scope of the function. And now moving on, speaking of scope, actually, we have something we can use nested functions, like we had nested loops before, like a loop within a loop. We also have functions within functions. And the scope of these functions, of nested functions, are only within the function that's outside. So let's define a new function called outer, with the parameter a again, colon, and then inside that function we're going to define another function called nested, and it's going to have its own parameter b, and then we're going to define it as return b equals a. And then to keep in line with our indentation, we have the actual code in the first outer function. So a is going to call nested and return value with the parameter a, and then it's going to return a. Now this looks kind of confusing, but basically the thing to see here is just nested can only be used within outer, and an outer utilizes nested as a part of its code. So let's do this. Let's print this out. So print outer with number, I don't know, 4, let's say. Print, and I forgot something. Hold on a sec. I forgot the semicolon. So here we have to use, with nested loops, you're going to have to use semicolons. So let's make that more clean. And just give me 1 second. Oh, my bad. I made a mistake. I read wrong. It's supposed to be multiplies. Alright, so 16. So as you can see, 4 times 4 is 16. So as you can see here, outer used the function nested, which took argument for a, and it was 4, which b was also 4. So as you can see, it did everything as it should have done. All right. So the whole concept of nested functions can be used for aggregating more functions as a result, and get with another function as well. So this might be a little complicated. So let me just, yeah, let's do it now. Let's just get it over with. So let's say we have a function called f, and with the parameter a, and then we're going to have inside that function called g, and it's going to have, so kind of a similar situation as before. Okay, so what we're going to do now, we're going to define both parameters in the following way. So let's first make our function again, return a times b. So don't forget your semicolon if you're using a function within a function. So actually here, there might be an error, but hold on, we'll see in a sec. Return g. Alright, so let's actually remove that. Maybe that was a typo. So we're going to print now. So we're going to call the function, the main function, the outer function, and then we're going to have two arguments in parentheses. So two parentheses, groups of parentheses after the other. So the first argument A is 5, and the second one is 2. So let's build this. As you can see, we got 10. So we actually made the second argument, in the nested function. We defined it, excuse me. So we defined it, and that's done in the following way. So we have the first function, the outer function, and then the nested function can be defined like this. And you could also do this again in aggregation. So let's add another function here inside f. So we're going to, inside a g actually, excuse me, we're going to have define, so we're having a loop within a loop within a loop. So it's kind of like loopception right here. So h, c, and then we're going to have just a semicolon, and then we're going to have, after that, we're going to have return a times b times c. And as you can see here, we have that. So we're going to then, after that, we're going to return h, and then outside of that, we're going to return g. So we have 3 arguments now, and you just add the parentheses on. Let's do that. As you can see, we got 5 times 2 times 30. So that pretty much concludes this section. Tune in next time.